The real threat here is the failure of the Supreme Court to protect Americans from government. That's our line of defense. The Supreme Court is there to make sure the federal government doesn't destroy our liberties, doesn't destroy our freedom. Our freedom and our liberties have been under assault by the government for generations. And the Supreme Court has been asleep at the switch. The Supreme Court has allowed the government to destroy our freedoms and our liberties by usurping powers that haven't been granted to it by the Supreme Court. That's why the Supreme Court is there. The Supreme Court is a check and balance. We have three branches of government, and the Supreme Court is our line in the sand. It's our last defense. If Congress passes an unconstitutional law and the government signs it, right, and it becomes law, the Supreme Court is supposed to strike it down. The Supreme Court is supposed to protect us, right? The Constitution is written to limit what the government could do, not to limit what the people could do. That law applies to the government. We have our own laws that are written that apply to us, and it's interesting too that none of the laws that apply to the people are up to interpretation, right? They all mean exactly what they say. It's only the law that applies to the government that supposedly is up for interpretation, because that gives the government carte blanche to ignore those laws. We don't want the government to ignore the law. We're a nation of laws, not a nation of men. And what that means is we enforce the actual law. If the law means whatever the men in charge want to pretend that it means, then we're not a nation of laws. It's a sham. We're a nation of men. The only way to be a nation of laws is to apply the law, including the Constitution, based on the original intent of the people who wrote the law. The first thing that comes to my mind as I'm listening to these senators is none of these guys or gals knows anything about the U.S. Constitution. And, you would think that they would, because they all swear an oath to support and defend it, from all enemies, domestic and foreign. That's, to be a senator, right? You got to swear this oath. You would think that they understood the document that they were swearing an oath to, but they're completely clueless. And it's not like the Constitution is very difficult to understand. It's actually a very easy document to understand. The problem is, if you understand it, it pretty much makes illegal almost everything the government already does. I'm talking about the federal government, and everything that the federal government wants to do. That's the reason that so many people have to pretend that they don't understand it, because they don't like what it says. In fact, they like to describe two schools of constitutional thought, right? There are people who want to interpret the Constitution based on the original intent of the people who wrote it, right? And then there's another group of people that say, hey, let's interpret the Constitution based on what we want it to mean, right? That the Constitution is some kind of living, breathing document that evolves over time, and so it means whatever we want it to mean. So the actual words that are written on the Constitution don't mean anything, because we could just impart whatever meaning we want into those words, and therefore we can change the Constitution, which of course in and of itself is complete nonsense. However, the states, they can do anything as long as the power is not denied to them by the states. Now, that doesn't mean the states were all powerful, because every state was limited by its own constitution, right? So the people were protected in the states by the state constitutions, but then the federal constitution said, here are some things that no state can do, regardless of whether or not it's authorized by its own constitution. We're going to ban it at the federal level. But other than that, the state can do whatever it wants, so long as it's not prohibited from doing so in its own constitution. So where are the few and defined federal powers expressed? Well, they're all in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. That's it. So grab yourself a constitution if you don't have one. I mean, they're on the internet. You can just look one up and you can look at it. It's not a big section. There's not a lot of words there. In fact, I'll just read again all of the powers the federal government has. And remember, if I don't read it, if the power is not on this list, it can't do it. That means anything the federal government does that is not enumerated in Article 1, Section 8 is unconstitutional. And see, this is why these hearings are so ridiculous, because Amy Coney Barrett can't admit, right, that almost everything the government is now doing is unconstitutional. Right? right? That's why she doesn't really want to comment on a lot of these cases or a lot of these questions, because I think she's smart enough to know that most of what the government is doing is unconstitutional. But because all this unconstitutional stuff is actually really bad, except that government doesn't know that. They actually think this stuff is good. But just because you think a program is going to do good doesn't mean you ignore the Constitution so that it can stand. You're supposed to ignore your personal opinions as to whether or not you think the law is going to do good or bad, and just decide whether or not the law is constitutional. And if the law is a good law, but it's unconstitutional, then Congress needs to change the Constitution so that it can now do this good thing that the Constitution does not authorize them to do. Except that's very difficult. A lot of these laws, a lot of these programs and taxes that politicians think are good, I don't think there's any way they would get a constitutional amendment to authorize them. So by having the Supreme Court amend the Constitution on its own without the legislative process being required, that makes it a lot easier for Congress and the presidents to get these big government programs that are clearly unconstitutional to get them enacted into law. But let me go back and look at Article 1, Section 8, right? The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, and imposts and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. So this gives the Congress the power to tax, but they can only do it to provide for the common defense and the general welfare. Right? The general welfare means for the welfare of everybody, not for the specific welfare of one individual, but for the general welfare of everybody.